Hi everyone, Terrible here, and welcome back to Jurassic Plastic. We're going to be taking a quick look today, a little review, a little walk around of one of my first Carnegie Collection models. This is the Carnegie Collection 1990 Deinonychus pack. Now, as you all know by now, when I say 1990, that was the original release of this model. The one that I have in my sample is a little later than that. You can tell that because looking at the information stamp text on the bottom, you can see where the word Miami, Florida has been scraped out. The words made in China have been scraped out. And the little CE mark has been added. That indicates that this model was made at least around 1991 or 1992, possibly towards 1993. I don't remember exactly when I bought this. I'm going to guess it was in 92. I bought this at a little local toy store in the town where I grew up, and they had the first assortment of Carnegie collections in there. I remember seeing this one in the little glass case and thinking to myself, Deinonychus is one of my favorite dinosaurs. And most of those Carnegie collections at that time for a kid were a little steep. My allowance money was not going to cover much more than this. So it seemed like a natural fit to buy this as one of my first Carnegies. My original one was the Pteranodon, as you can read about on my website, but the Deinonychus was definitely high on my priority list. And I had not previously seen the Deinonychus before 1992. I guess because I didn't have that little local toy store open yet. When I got the Pteranodon in 1989, this model had not been released yet. But aside from the information stamp, the Deinonychus did not go through too many different changes during its production. This model was retired in 1996, and they did not update it. They did not retool it or resculpt it. They simply ceased production. I don't know if it was the best seller. The fact that there aren't too many differences between the different iterations of this tells me that, they probably were not using the mold that much to do a lot of production runs. The detail is a little chunky on these, which is characteristic of the early 90s. In the Carnegie Collection in the early 90s, they were really tooling these a little extra. The first run of Carnegies had a lot more subtle sculpting. Now, I don't know if Forrest Rogers was responsible for doing the actual tooling on this. I feel like some of these early 90s ones, they may have exaggerated the sculpt a little bit when it arrived at the factory just to make it show up better in the mold, especially on a very, very small model like this. This model is technically a four-piece model. And as far as I know, aside from the separate, companion type Carnegies like the Dilophosaurus pair, the Maiasaur with the nest, this is the only Carnegie model that was actually put together from three different pieces and not even really as a joined mold. But they seem like they molded the base and the three different Deinonychus individuals separately. You can see that it's just simply glued onto the base here. And it doesn't even really match the way that something that had been part of the same mold and that was just kind of divided up would match. Like I said earlier, the detail on this is a little bit chunky. It's hard to get detail on such a small model, I guess, especially in the early 90s without the technology that we have today. That would have been tricky. It's got these very, very proportionately large scales compared to the body, which seems a little bit, toyish, a little bit cartoonish. From a distance, it looks okay. But I feel like this, rather than just leaving the skin smooth, obviously it would have been nice in 1990 if we could have gotten a feathered Deinonychus. Clearly a few artists and paleontologists were kind of pushing that idea by that time. I think it's not surprising that we didn't get a feathered Deinonychus. It is surprising that we didn't get any feathered Carnegie Collection until, 2005? That is a little surprising. But in the early 90s, this was to be expected. However, I kind of wish that they had gone more with the first run Dimetrodon tactic of just leaving the skin smooth with a few wrinkly textures and leaving more room for a more subtle paint job. The paint job on these is, I'm not a big fan of it. It's a little simple. It's a little crude. You can see it's just got a few stripes. A couple of the stripes are connected by a line on the back. And the back of them has a little bit of this golden wash, a little yellowish on the back. And the body is this tan color. So it's just painted tan. You can see that if I can zoom in here, the plastic underneath is gray, undyed plastic. Same thing goes for the base. You can see in a couple of little paint rubs here that the base is fully painted. This yellowish is not the plastic color. The yellowish color here is actually paint, and you can see it's a little bit glossy and a little textured on the bottom. And it's got a nice little brown wash over the top. Some of the later iterations of this did away with that brown wash, eliminating a little bit of the subtlety and nice looking ground, which unfortunately, in my opinion, is probably the nicest part of the model. I really do appreciate the bases in some of the early Carnegie Collection, and I wish that they had stuck with them, especially for some of the smaller models, because it adds a little bit more value, and it's like a little diorama piece that it comes with. I don't really care that it's not removable. What is unfortunate is the flexibility of this vinyl. These are not super rubbery. They're the same kind of medium weight gray vinyl that all of the 1990 Carnegie figures were coming out in, replacing the earlier really hard black PVC. Unfortunately, this leaves them prone to bending. So you can see that this individual is really leaning over when it probably should be more straight. This individual tends to lean forward when it really should be more in an upward position. I have seen some samples that are still in an upward position, kind of like it's running forward. It would have been nice if they sculpted these in the same kind of hard plastic that the earlier, like Maiasaura on the nest and Protoceratops came in, because then I think they wouldn't warp so much. And it's not like these are necessarily really skinny ankles either. They made the feet too big and too chunky in order to lend stability. Clearly that did not work, at least over a long period of time. But I remember even when I first bought these, they were leaning all over the place. I don't think that this was the best design choice for plastic. Returning back to the color scheme, you can see that none of the claws are painted, which is a little unfortunate since Deinonychus is especially known for its sickle claws. You think they could at least put a little dab of paint on there. The eyes look way too big just because of the way they've been done with this really obvious black circle around them. It looks better on some samples, even between individuals on the stand. Like, I think this one over here looks okay. The way that eye came out is not bad. The one on this one just looks horrible, and the circle is really off-center. This one here just kind of looks a little crude and cartoonish. They also have this little blue, very, very, very light blue stripe on the snout on all three of them, which you can see on a lot of the earlier samples of Deinonychus, and I think that even carried over to more of the head in some of the later samples that I've seen online. Unfortunately, that blue, which could add a little splash of color to these, is so light and such a very light wash. It almost looks like they painted it on with watercolor type paint, and it's barely visible. You really have to be looking for it. The mouth is also painted a little bit crudely. You can see that the teeth are simply painted on. There are teeth in the sculpt here, but they don't quite line up with the paint. The pink on the inside of the mouth does bleed over the edges a little bit, giving them that weird kind of piranha look. Although I have to say my sample is not nearly as bad as some of the later samples I've seen. I've seen some circa 1993 or 94 samples of Deinonychus where like half their face is pink. Like they just got this mouth like when the gums on a shark become visible. It really looks bad. So I'm kind of glad that I got a fairly early sample. A little bit of that blue wash you can see also extends onto the belly, where you've got these bigger, chunkier, rectangular scales. Once again, it doesn't look great, and the sculpting on the claws is very crude. It's a little rounded on some of them. The ones where it's not rounded, it's a little blocky, where it's literally flat, like the mold just kind of ends there. You can see the mold line physically does end there, because this little individual figure was molded together with the sickle claw only on that side of the mold, the rest of the foot on that side of the mold, which just leaves it flat. Once again, at a distance, that's not something you're going to notice, but I wish they had put a little bit more attention to detail. I'm guessing that this was already kind of an expensive figure to produce just because of the number of parts and the complexity to assembling it. And once again, I think these early Carnegie figures are a little above scientific scrutiny at this point. They're very vintage. And as in terms of an early 90s representation of Deinonychus, I think this is fine. Most representations at that time did not have the correct hands. These are all pronated, obviously, but if you can find me a non-pronated Deinonychus hand in the early 90s, I would love to see it. So you can't really fault the artist on that one. The fingers at least seem to be about the correct proportion, unlike some other Deinonychus models from the same time, like for example the Dino Riders one or the Definitely Dinosaurs Play School one. It's got the much longer second digit, at least on this hand. Some of these other ones I think the mold is a little funky. So overall, it's a charming little figure, or set of figures, however you want to think about it. Just the fact that there's some flexibility, I guess, gives a little bit of play value. I do recall it being a little hard to play with these, though, because they kind of all have to go together, and they have a big heavy stand attached to them. It's clearly designed to be more of a display piece than a play piece, which a lot of the early Carnegie Collection models, obviously that was kind of their goal, was to be more of a museum replica, less of a toy, and clearly that changed as the line went on in the 90s. So there you have it, the Carnegie Collection Deinonychus. Oh, I forgot to talk about scale. If you measure this from nose to tip along the spine, they do come out to be exactly 1/40 scale. But I have to point out that the proportions are off. These seem to be based on the classic Deinonychus painting by John Sibbick. You can tell because of the shape of the head, the posture, the length of the arms, the little waddles here. And he also did give his Deinonychus too short of a tail, even compared to the classic Bob Bacher drawing of Deinonychus. So I don't know if that was something of a perspective thing in his original illustration, but you see a lot of Deinonychus models where the tails are just too short compared to the body. So being that the proportions are wrong, even though these are scaled so that for their length they are 1/40 scale, they are too big. If you put them next to a human figure like my little Mark's caveman here, this is the one where he's going to bash somebody in the head with a rock, it's a little too tall. Even if I put the caveman up on the base with the Deinonychus, they should really be more like waist height, so they're a little too big to be 1/40. I think if you wanted to put them in a really old school like 135, 130 diorama, they would fit in just fine. And it's fudgeable at 1/40. I mean, obviously if you have this model and you're going to display it, you're not going for scientific accuracy anyway. So, you know, as like a Jurassic Park raptor or something, they're fine. There we have the Carnegie Collection Deinonychus from about 1991 or 1992. I hope you enjoyed this video review and walk around. I do have a lot more in the works. I've been filming some based on your requests, so tune in next week for another exciting review from Jurassic Plastic, and I'll see you next time.